Hi, so today we're going to be doing a directed discussion with Teresa Muse here in the Indigenous Center here at Mount St. Vincent University. We'll be discussing Indigenous culture, peoples, and issues and how they relate to secondary curriculums in the HRCE. Gwe, will you guys get? Need up Gasaloo?
Hello.
Hello. So I'll start with the land acknowledgement. This discussion is being conducted on the educational institution of Mount St. Vincent University. The university lays on the land known as Jibuktuk, meaning Great Harbor, or anglicized as Shibukto. Jibuktuk is located in the region of Sebekne-Gituk in the Mi'kmaq Nation. Sebekne-Gituk, Jibuktuk, the Mi'kmaq Nation, and indigenous cultures, in tandem with the lands that were nurtured them, were never surrendered or ceded to any European settler. The seizure of these lands and assaulting of the culture of the indigenous peoples was illegal by the standards of the European settlers' own laws. Yet a Western world has been built on these lands with false promises of a cultural equality which has never come to fruition. Steps to achieve land status neutrality are still and may always be necessary.
Yeah, what we're just trying to do here is to have a nice discussion with Teresa and just to talk about indigeneity within secondary schools, reflecting on what we've learned throughout this course and what we want to take as knowledge going further into our careers as educators. So just to start with the first question. So Teresa, how do you think the Eurocentric language used to teach decolonization issues in public schools affect the school's ability to effectively communicate the culture we are attempting to decolonize?
And just before I touch on that question, there's a couple of things I'd like to just, I guess, just bring for clarity is when we do use the word indigenous, we must always remember we're talking about the First Nation, the Inuit, and the Métis. I think sometimes we get confused with, we'll say this is an indigenous project when we really mean it's a Mi'kmaq project. Or it's a Mi'kmaq project and we're calling it an indigenous, like vice versa. So just to make it clear that we are dealing with a specific project here. And I always like to use the term the First Nation instead of First Nations with an S. I've been taught through the elders that when we say First Nations, it makes us sound like there's a whole bunch of nations, and we're not. We're just the First Nation of this territory, of Canada. And even the government will say they sit down with nation to nation at the table. So it's very interesting that I don't know how society, and I mean, we all say it, we're all guilty of putting that S, but when I had the elder teach me about that, I was like, oh, that makes sense. It's like we are the First Nation, like we need to put that the in front of it, and that, and when you say that, it has a lot more meaning, right? Than if you say First Nations, I feel like that waters down the concept of the First Nation. So just wanted to put that in. And of course being here in Mi'kma'ki, when we say that, like welcome to Mi'kma'ki, and we stop and think how long we've been here, over 14,000 years through the artifacts, I'm not sure what it would be like for any other community from the First Nation within Canada. I don't know the history so much there, but it's interesting to see, like, yeah, that's definitely the First Nation if they've been around for that long. Anyway, I just wanted to share those couple of things before starting to answer the questions.
Absolutely, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. So how I think about this is that my first thoughts is when I read the question, and I say this respectfully, guys, is how could you have asked me that question in a simpler manner?
Okay.
Right? From a perspective of educating,
Absolutely.
Right? It's like, okay, so because I literally had to read it a couple times to really, okay, what are they asking me here? I mean, and then of course they came around to it. But I thought, oh, but that's a good example. To answer that, it's like,
it is.
Just simple. Simpleness, the more simpler it is, the better it is, no matter. And that's probably maybe for working with anybody for that matter. But I know that's the biggest thing when working with community. Make it as simple as possible. Right? Don't have to make it complicated. And the English language, I find, when we interpret our language, for example, the meanings are different. Like just when we say kwe, right away you just think, oh, hi. But it means more than just hi. It's like when we say Ipjalasi. and I've shared this, is that it means more than just welcome. It means come in. I'm going to offer you the best I have to offer. You know, it's like the story I share about in the days of our ancestors when the elders would invite people into the wigwam. They would tell them to go around to the other side of the fire because that's the warmest place to sit. So that shows you that they were offering the best that they had, and that was it. So when we look at interpretations of just the interpreting our words into English, we really need to be careful that we're not making it sound more simplistic. There's a time where it's, you know,
absolutely.
We really need to be careful on how we describe that, because we may not be describing the actual interpretation of that word. Okay, so that's one thing, and like I said, that a good example is using the word Ipjalasi, right? Yep. And you know what? No matter what we do, whether it's in the school system or any other institution out there or any other government department or doesn't matter, organization, you're never going to get 100% support.
Of course.
Right? It doesn't matter who you are, what you do, and there's always going to be, unfortunately, haters. There's always going to be people with bad attitudes. There's going to always be racism. But what we can do is, I feel like if we start with the younger we can start educating, the better it will be as time goes on. And I hate to say this, but it's almost like what the residential school did to us.
Yeah.
Is they took our young, you know, they forgot the older ones because they wanted to start with them young so they could, you know, for better choice of words, brainstorm them into thinking the way they wanted them to think. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of like, for us though, I see this more in a positive way. It's like, no, let's start educating at a young age so that maybe we can begin to get rid of the not so much hate and not so much bad attitudes and prejudice and racism. It could do that. So then in a couple generations from now, it might be interesting to be able to come back and do your research again and see if things have changed, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. When you guys are my age. Let's keep fingers crossed. And the other concept that I think is very important about this as well is the whole the whole concept of ownership.
Yeah.
Ownership is an English word that isn't really part of our vocabulary. First of all, the Mi'kmaq vocabulary, and I'm sure might be for other communities in the First Nation. And what I mean by that is when we look at ownership, and if we look at it from a historical perspective, you can read things and you'll hear different elders being commented on saying, we don't own Mother Earth. Mm-hmm. Right? We don't have the right to own the waters and this and that. And so, unfortunately, the systems that our historical systems, non-Indigenous systems that plagued us, also helped us in thinking more like, you know, the opposite is like, oh no, you can have ownership. However, when they created the reserve life, the on-reserve life, there's still no thing as ownership. Nobody owns their home. Nobody has a deed to private property on reserve. So it's interesting how that was the concept of the government of the day, but that's not what they allowed us on our reserves. They're like, oh, okay, if you don't want to have ownership, we'll put you on the reserve and you won't have ownership of anything. So I myself, and they still do in the communities, we still do not have ownership of lands or anything like that. So that's a good example too of when we look at interpretation. So even that word, trying to interpret that in the Mi'kmaq, I would be interested in speaking to someone who does know the language and ask them what would be the interpretation of ownership, if there is such a word. Because we don't have a word for interpretation word for education, like formal education. There's no Mi'kmaq word. Education in our language means from when you're born to the time you go to the spirit world. That's education, right? Which is different from what we're taught education is from the formal school system. So that's just a couple examples of that I hope answers that question a little bit.
That's very cool.
Absolutely.
Okay, perfect.
You touched on a lot of what I was hoping we would be able to discuss here, especially with the ownership. Because as you were saying, you're not even sure what a word for ownership would be in the Mi'kmaq language, right? And language is really shaped by the culture that it's generated from. And the settlers that were my ancestors that came over here, their mindset of their relationship with the land was, this is my land, I own this land. So it was almost impossible for them to conceptualize a group of people living on land and not owning it.
Right.
So when we have these land acknowledgements in the public school system, they always state that the land is unceded. And for it to be unceded, that would imply that it rightfully belongs to the Mi'kmaq people. But in that itself, as you were saying, nobody owns this land from the Mi'kmaq view, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So the Eurocentric language, the English language, is introducing this concept of ownership directly into the discussion. And do you feel like that itself makes it harder to even express the Indigenous and Mi'kmaq culture in its truest form?
Yeah, I think that's misleading.
Yeah.
Right? Because in the land acknowledgements, when they say unceded and that sort of stuff, well, still, it's not that we're trying to own it or get it back as owning it. We just want to learn how we can all, two-eyed seeing, like how we can all work in this together and live in it. Because we still, many of our people, and I'm not saying this for 100%, as I said, we have the same issues too, but many of our people still say, we don't own the waters, we don't own the lands, we don't own, all the things that Mother Earth provides. We're just like caretakers, or we're stewards of that, and we need to take care of it. I love the concept that it says, Mother Earth doesn't need us to survive, but we need Mother Earth to survive. And so when we look at ownership, I think that's the interpretation we would give. It's not a matter, although don't get me wrong, we totally understand the non-Indigenous concepts. Like, we know that their way of life is about ownership. I mean, let's face it, I own a house off the reserve, and and I have a deed, and I pay the taxes and all that sort of thing, but it's still something that's foreign to me.
Absolutely.
Because it's like, oh yeah, okay, I had to, I'm at an older age learning about that whole thing. And so many of our people on the reserve who's lived there their whole lives have never had to deal with that concept of ownership and what that means, right? Now, don't get me wrong, people have, live in their homes, and they have, their lawns and their gardens and things like that outside, but there's no divide, there's no clear concept of, this part is your land and this part is my land, and stay up, that just doesn't exist. So
it reminds me of one of the academic articles we read from an author from the First Nation, and I really enjoyed their choice of words, where they said instead of inhabit, they use cohabit, where it's more of a shared environment,
right?
And they are stewards, and that implies harmony.
Yes.
And further, I really liked what you had to say about the language, because I just kept thinking about how you described the Mi'kmaq language as using words that are surrounded with context, and the English language is almost empty context, that you need like the sentence of a word, or like a structure of words to really give something meaning. And I couldn't have thought of a better example when you mentioned the First Nation compared to just First Nations, and we just use that term and think that's completely okay. And the other one that I was going to ask you about was how in spell check and even in English classes today that Indigenous isn't capitalized.
Yeah, that's right.
Your thoughts on
and
that?
It's a big thing. Well, I think from the English language perspective, if we use their own, I don't know what you call it, their own system, then Indigenous would have been capitalized. They capitalize Indian, right? So I'm like, well, what would be any different? For me, I capitalize it. It's like when I say elders, I capitalize elders. But again, dictionaries and all the other things don't do that. So there's so many of us have different teachings. And I mean, even what I said about the First Nation, now you can probably even talk to leaders and even government themselves, and they may have a good reason why they call us First Nations. And I haven't heard that yet, but I'm willing to listen if they do, right? I just, but to me, this is what got talked to me, and I'm like, okay, that makes sense. you know. And so that's just an example, I think, of when we look at all of these interpretations or the way we look at things. What I'm sharing with you are just my teachings or the things that I've learned in my days growing up. And a lot of it is based on what I've learned from elders and talking to people who are very culturally knowledgeable and things like that. And so those pieces I really agree with. And I'm like, yeah, you know what, I like that. And I'm going to put that in my own journey. And those are the educational pieces I'm going to share. So that's where that comes from. Now, you could sit and maybe ask this question to somebody else, get a whole together different answer.
I would hope so.
Yeah, right, yeah. And maybe even opposite of what I would say. But I think that's where we're at, though, as a culture or as an indigenous groups, is that that door has only recently opened for us to even be sitting at the table and talking, right?
Yeah.
You know, and I think TRC did that. We had talking before, that fair enough. But I'm saying it's rippled out to community level, right? And I'm seeing more and more universities, for example, really opening their doors, and it's just, I mean, that's why I like being here, because the Mount St. Vincent is really opening their doors, you know, to what they have to offer. I'm going to need my water.
That's okay.
Can I go get it?
Yeah, I can pause this.
Okay, birds are the way.
There we are.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm glad you got the water.
Yes, yes.
Before we move on to the next question, there's one more thing when it comes to the discussion about language I'd like to talk about. And that is, we've used the term reserve quite a bit in the discussion of this first question.
Yep.
So the reserve, that word is a word that was used by the Canadian government to label these Indigenous communities. And what we were taught in lecture was that there's actually very harmful connotations around this term. So another thing with that language is it's so commonly used from settlers and other cultures that are newly coming to Canada to refer to these places as reserves. And do you believe that again just perpetuates this bad image?
Oh, that's an interesting one. Again, depending on who you're talking to, you will have those that don't even like the word Indigenous.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, fair.
Yeah. So and usually they'll tell you.
Of course.
For me, I know most of the labels and titles that's placed upon us come from government. It comes from the Indian Act. Even though we're called the First Nation, they still call it the Indian Act. Why isn't it the First Nation Act?
And in the actual government documents, it's still referred to as Indian, no matter where you find it.
Right.
In hundreds of places in
Yes.
the legal documents.
Yeah. So to me, right away, that causes me a little confusion as a person from the First Nation.
Absolutely.
I'm like, okay, why is that still called the Indian Act, right?
Yeah.
Why can't they come up with a better terminology? You sit down with the leaders and come up with a better terminology. I think maybe it's because it's just government system and they don't work fast. Now, as far as using the word reserve, in my educational teachings, I will use the Indian Act because I will talk about the different titles that's placed upon us. But in the Indian Act, we have, they use the terms reserve and band. And so I will explain that because we hear that a lot. And so when you hear the term reserve, you know that refers to the land that the government has set aside for the First Nation to use, okay? The band is the name of the First Nation group that uses that reserve land. And so we say that there are people that live on reserve and live off reserve, okay? I live off the reserve. My family lives on reserve. So we still use that terminology to be able to distinguish where you live. Now, here in the city, now what we're hearing more, I should say before I say this, is community. You're hearing the term community. So it's like, which Mi'kmaq community are you from? So I would say I'm from Bear River, but I live off reserve.
Okay.
Right? Okay. But yet here in the urban setting, the Friendship Center is my community, but it's not on reserve.
Yeah.
So there's, I think that whole terminology is something new that's been sprouting, and I think many of our people are still learning how to distinguish that, just like to distinguish between what's Indigenous and what's Mi'kmaq, right? So it's the same idea as that. What's the difference between reserve and community, and on-reserve and off-reserve? And the on and off-reserve terms are also used in identity, too, because it makes a big difference whether you are a band member living on reserve, or you're a band member living off reserve, or you're not even a band member and you don't live on reserve, you've never lived on reserve, that sort of thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it's a whole workshop in itself.
Well, I completely understand that. I had never even considered how the term reserve would be used so divisively and like utilized so well by the community as an aspect of identity to distinguish amongst yourselves. I think that's very empowering and very. I even take a step further. I'd say that's pretty reclaiming in terms, because reserve, written in the Indian Act, is a term that was very, very assimilative and oppressing.
Yes.
But to use it in a term, I'm living off reserve. I'm living on reserve. I think that's very healthy for the community.
Oh yeah, and we still do it. Like, I mean, it's like we could say we're part of the community. We're part of the Bear River Band, for example.
Yeah.
But I just don't live on reserve.
For sure.
Right?
Yeah.
What's the other thing I was going to share about that too? It'll come back to me here in a minute. But yeah, it's very complicated and very challenging, and there are different perspectives on it as well.
Absolutely.
Oh, I know what I was going to share. In the United States, they call them reservations.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's the difference too. Like for Canada, it's reserves, but in the United States, it's reservations.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
And just before we wrap up this question, when it comes to the topic of language, are there any terms that you see or notice, or words even, that should really be avoided when describing the First Nation community, or at large, or words that settlers may say that have a different meaning?
I can't really say for sure. I just know, like, other than what we've already talked about and shared. And like I said, you will have, you'll get corrected if someone disagrees. Like if someone is very adamant about their.
And I'm sure that's
thoughts.
also a divisive question.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I just think that. For me, so many things that I share are for educational purposes. Whether someone else agrees with it or disagrees with it, but it's still part of our history. It's still part of our culture, and it still plagues us or is still with us. So I think it's important for the non-Indigenous society to know these things, and that's why we have many of us out there doing cultural education, just so that we can bring light to a lot of these things. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much for that question.
We'll go to the next question, which is, do you think the concentration of Indigenous peoples into Indigenous communities, reserves, in turn causing certain schools to have high Indigenous populations and some to have none? This creates a weird distribution of the population, causes students that grow up with no Indigenous peers to have a harder time conceptualizing Indigenous culture and a harder time deconditioning their view of Indigenous peoples as others. In other words, if they grow up with no Indigenous peers, they're more likely to have Indigenous culture and peoples kind of mythologized in their head.
Well, in this day and age, in present day, I think we're seeing this more and more now. And it's becoming very complicated. And I can now almost see what our elders went through in their ages growing up as well, because I'm kind of seeing it myself. And I'm like, wow, if I'm dealing with these issues and challenges, it must have been the same for them when we were kids growing up and they were seeing the changes that was happening within us. So I think that still prevails and probably always will. Like I said, another 3 or 4 or 5 generations from now, and if we were lucky enough to be sitting here talking about this, it would be interesting if we would have, number one, the same questions, or number two, would we have the same answers? It would be really interesting. I always said I'd like to be that little mouse in the corner in that like 5 or 6, 7 generation, just to hear, I wonder how they're doing down there. How they're doing, yeah. Okay, so some answers. First of all, I think geographics has a big impact. And what I mean by that is if you grew up on reserve, you're going to learn a certain culture you're going to learn certain things about your culture living in a community. One thing that I wanted to share too when we talk about culture is everybody has a culture, right?
That's true.
That's one thing. It just seems like when we say culture in society, we base it with a race,
Yeah.
right? Particularly minorities.
And it's
right?
absolutely not a binary.
No, and but when we look at culture, it's everywhere. Like golfers, they're a culture.
Yeah.
Doctors teachers are a culture.
Yeah.
Teenagers are a culture, right? I mean, when you look at it, everybody has a culture. And we, growing up, had a culture, but it was an on-reserve culture during my time growing up that was very strict ruling under the Indian Act. So when I say that, and even before my generation, so like my dad's generation and probably his family's generation, is when we weren't allowed to practice anything traditional. We couldn't play our drums, we couldn't do our smudging, we couldn't do anything that took us away from the belief of something else, like their way that they wanted us to believe. That's why the residential schools were instilled, so that it could, the simplest quote that I've heard used time and time again is they wanted to take the Indian out of the Indian, right? And they did that very, very, very well. So my dad, who went to the residential school, when I think about all the things we missed out growing up as a child, I'm not saying I finger point, but I do believe the residential school contribute to a lot of that.
Absolutely.
When I hear some of the stories of the residential school survivors and what they dealt with after they came home, from the residential school, that, things weren't all rosy. They weren't always welcomed back. Some of them were made fun of. Some of them couldn't find family connection anymore. Some of them couldn't find community connection anymore. Some of them took, not the best routes in dealing with their life choices and life challenges. So one of the things I was always told was that when my father went to residential school, it would have been a time where the language was more prevalent. And so when they got to the residential school, and my father was there for 5 years, now I don't know how long it takes to take a language from a child, but like he had 5 years of not being allowed to speak his language. So that would have stayed with him in his growing up years, because like I mentioned in the workshop that I did was even when they came back, many of them were still too scared to start talking the language because they thought they were going to get punished, right? This sort of thing. So these fears were still there. And so when I looked at when we were old enough, I guess, we were all born, my siblings and I, my father was not able to teach us the language because he no longer knew it. Or maybe his concept was he didn't want to teach it to us because he knew he believed it was still a bad thing, right? It's like education. I quit high school in grade 9 and had his support 100% because I now think, oh, well, he probably saw school as a bad thing. It's like, no, come out of there. I don't want you to deal with what I had to deal with. Like he never said that, but now I think back on it. That's why, his concept of school wouldn't have been a good positive one. So he probably still feared that would be what was happening for us as well. Luckily for me, though, despite that, it wasn't that I wanted to quit school. I just didn't like the school system and what it was providing me. Because at that time, it was very high racism, prejudice, and all that good stuff. Or not good stuff, bad stuff. And but I did then go on to vocational school, they called it then, as opposed to community college. So I went there and got a couple certificates there, and then eventually ended up, having a hairdressing profession, as a professional hairdresser and all that good stuff. But then it was later in life, like in my late 20s, that I realized that someone had brought to my attention that, you could go to university. It's called a mature student. And I'm like, but I only got grade 9 education. They said, doesn't matter. If you can read and write and, do all, you can still go. So it worked out that the Friendship Center is where I went to just to get some support to see how they could help me do some counseling. they're the ones that encouraged me to go to university. And so we applied. 2 weeks later, I got my, yeah, sure, come on. So I went to Dell. Didn't have two clues about anything. And at that time, I had learned that professors at that time, and we're talking the late 80s here, by the way, but one of the things I found was professors were definitely not educated about Indigenous history, or the only part that I felt that most of them were educated was the books, what they've read through books or what they saw in movies.
Yeah.
I clearly experienced that in my time at university in a number of ways, but made it through because we had a counseling unit like this at Dalhousie. And that's what got us through, because we were able to come together. We were all there like, oh my gosh, do you know how to do this paper? Do you know how to answer this question? Do you know this prof? Like, we were our big supports to each other.
Your own community.
We were right. We had our community, and we had culture. That counseling unit was a culture. And the minute I walked through that door, I knew I was safe, right?
Wow.
So those things are very important, and I think even more so important today, because of the diversity amongst our Indigenous students.
Yeah.
Like I said, you have those who grew up on reserve, those who didn't, those who grew up with understanding traditional culture, and those that didn't, those that are just finding out now that they had ancestry. And what does that mean? They don't know what that means, but they know it's there. So they're now searching out at an older age, trying to figure this out. So that whole geographics is very important.
Of course,
It has a big impact. And also geographics in the sense of where that community is located. Mm-hmm. My community of Bear River was very isolated from the mainstream population. Now you take Millbrook and Truro, like, look what's happened. Like, they're blossoming, right? Because they're right in the heart of the economy, and businesses and what have you. Like, they're just in a perfect resource area that they can almost become, quite self-sufficient. Yeah. Where Bear River, we're still in that isolated area, and we'll probably never, ever be in the same area or playing field as Millbrook because of our geographics and where we're located. Okay. Also, other things is that whole community teachings and cultural practices and things, like I said, like that, modern versus tradition. I'm even learning that, even for me, I'm struggling now with modern day thoughts, like just even high school or university students, how they think, today, and what culture means to them, and what Indigenous even means to them, and what tradition means to them, and it's altogether different from when I was in university. And even now, that, like I said, at the age I'm at, I'm now having to learn all new things, right? And I have also learned on the other side is, now I know why elders just sit in their rocking chair and enjoy the day, right? Because it's so much easier to just sit in my rocking chair and braid my sweetgrass or make my basket, whatever I got to do, because it's less challenging, right? But at the same time, it's also something, though, that many of our people are still trying to figure out, right? And how we're adjusting and how we're learning about this two-eyed seeing. And which I think is another big piece that comes into this, is even for our own people, particularly those that didn't grow up with our traditional cultures and stuff, they're even seeking out the two-eyed seeing themselves because they want to learn too, right? For myself, I feel like for many of us who did grow up on reserve and in community and has always worked for Indigenous organizations and that sort of thing, I always felt we kind of always had two-eyed seeing because we grew up with it. It's the non-Indigenous society that I feel we're trying to help educate about two-eyed seeing. It's like, here's our way of doing things, and we know your way of doing things because we dealt with it our whole, for many generations, like when we look at the Indian Act, right? And then it's like, but here's how we can try to blend these together and figure out how can we both move in a positive way where it's a win-win situation, right? And it can be done, seeing it happening, right? So that's good. And the other thing when it comes to our Indigenous students or people on a whole is that you need community If you don't have community, you're going to have a much bigger challenge going through life without some kind of connection. And I say that because I even personally did that when I moved to the city. I didn't realize how much community did affect my way of life. Even though I didn't live on the reserve, I'd only lived a kilometer from it, or at the time a mile. But still, all my family lived there, and I did get to go back and be chief for a term, 2-year term. So that kind of stuff always kept me, plus working with the Mi'kmaq organizations, I was always in community. Yeah. So when I stopped those jobs and stopped being involved with community, that's when, I don't know, for better choice of words, I just started feeling lost. My spirit started to get low. I just didn't feel connection to anything, but I just didn't know why, and I didn't know how to fix it, and I didn't even know I was missing community. That was my biggest challenge. So when I got to work at the Friendship Center after all these years, it hit me like within probably even the first day of work, it hit me like, oh, this is it. This is what I've been missing, right? Yeah. And so that actually got me back on the track of knowing how important community is. You got to have community, and I would say that to any student that was out there searching, or anybody for that matter, is find some place or something that makes you have community, whether it's this place, whether it's the Friendship Center, whether it is a non-reserve community, whether it's your own group, your own Indigenous group that you might set up. But you got to have community, and you have to keep that connection, right? Yeah. It's like I said, when students walk in here, or when I walked into that student counseling unit, right away, the minute I opened that door, it was just like I walked into a big smudging ceremony, and it was like, there, I got community, right? And that's how I feel when I go to the Friendship Center. I'm excited when I go to the Friendship Center. When I walk in there, it's just like coming home. It is like coming home. So, yeah, so that's really important because community helps you to feel belonging. It helps you to feel welcomed. It makes you feel like you're not alone. Yeah. It gives you all the things that you didn't even know you needed. Right? Yeah, in a positive way, right?
So, yeah, definitely. I like that answer. So the phenomenon that I described in the question with some people never really being around Indigenous peers growing up is something that I ask because that very much applies to me. I grew up in an area I wasn't anywhere near a reserve, an Indigenous community, so I really didn't have many Indigenous peers until I was 17, and I moved away to Cape Breton University, which is near the Membertou community. So for me, it was quite a long time before I really was able to, as a non-Indigenous person, have exposure to the Indigenous culture and the Mi'kmaq culture, which seems to be something that you believe is a phenomenon, but outweighing that on the other side of the issue is the positivity the community, the sense of community gives, right? And how having community is so tightly knit that supports the culture, that allows people from Mi'kmaq Nation to be accepted, to feel home, and just overall just a largely positive effect.
Yep. And don't get me wrong, not everybody feels the same way about reserves and living there.
Yeah.
Right? And they are two different cultures.
Yeah.
You know, living on reserve and living off reserve, totally two different cultures. And so that's really interesting because when you go to community, and don't get me wrong, you know, I'm not saying that it's the Garden of Eden, you know, living on reserve, but there is this sense of community that you do quickly learn about and develop. And you don't get that if you're not around it. And for non-Indigenous people, mostly everybody that I've ever ran into that has like either had a chance to work on reserve in a community, or even if it's the Friendship Center, or they take part in a lot of the ceremonies or events that's going on. Like I've had so many people come to me and say, wow, this is so cool. Like I love that connection. Like they feel it, you know, they even feel it, that I know what you're talking about. You can feel that sense of community, and I've even had some say, gee, I wish I could get that all the time, right? And things like that. But we do have a lot of non-Indigenous people working in our communities that definitely, hopefully leave. When they do leave with that positive experience, and carries that forth, because that's the kind of education that helps us too. Like when non-Indigenous people are able to take that same information I'm out there trying to share, and then you have non-Indigenous people doing it too, like that just really, to me that helps tremendously.
Yeah,
absolutely.
We're trying to get society to look at things in a different perspective. Yeah.
As a follow-up from your own experiences, I know geography will play a big part in this question as well, but you mentioned how culture was almost silenced from the residential schools, and
traditional culture,
and how there was like generational trauma and disruption caused by that system. Do you notice now, maybe not so much your generation from the traditional knowledge and culture being passed down, but do you see the current generations? Is that culture like growing and coming back?
Yes, I find it is when they're involved with community.
Yeah.
If they're not involved with community, I see a difference in that. I really do. And I find that it's different kind of teachings too. And even in our own communities, you also will have some that aren't on the same amount of teachings that another person might have too. Like they're maybe just there learning, or they've been in the community, but they don't practice.
Yeah.
Or follow the traditional teachings, right? Like it's not something they're into, but they still live in community. And then you have those that's all they're doing, like they're just taking it for everything that they can give, that's bringing that traditions back. And that's one of the challenges we're facing, whether you're on reserve or off reserve, is we have that coming back in different, like piecemeal.
Yeah.
So you don't have 100% of any community or 100% of any of our people all following the same walk. Like we could have 50 people, Mi'kmaq people in here, and group us off, and we're all going to be in different stages with the cultural teachings and practices, right? And so it is a very challenging time in society, because I call us the rekindling generation, and I say the Mi'kmaq and the people of the First Nation, is that we are rekindling in the sense that we're now allowed to practice our traditional teachings. We're allowed to not be afraid to go to jail because we're lighting our sweetgrass. We can stand and hold our eagle feather and be proud of it, things like that. We can play our drums. However, it doesn't mean everybody's going to want to do that.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And so that's the other part when we're looking at the school system, is to avoid, or try to avoid, if you've got Indigenous students, don't put them all in the same basket. Because you may have one who's all about like, oh yeah, I play drums, I sing songs, I do sweat lodges, and the other child does absolutely nothing. But yet I've seen it happen. It's happened to me where the teacher will say, isn't that correct, Teresa? And I'm like, I don't know, because I don't practice that, or I don't, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And it puts you on the spot. I can remember when I was in elementary school, I would fake sick on days that it was history, because I knew what we were going to be talking about, and we're going to be talking about the Micmac trading beads for furs and all this stuff, right? And I hated those days, because that's what the teacher would do. After saying all this stuff, they'd say, isn't that correct, Teresa? And I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah.
I only know John Wayne country movies,
Well, that reminds me of a lot of the first thing you mentioned before we even got into the questions, was just a vast oversimplification.
Yeah, and even so for our culture, when I say we're rekindling, that rekindling's coming back in different ways, in different times, different methods, different whatever. And so we as a people are challenged within ourselves on how this all plays out and how this looks. I can't imagine what it must be like for a non-Indigenous person to step into this and try to figure it out too, because we're figuring it out. So it's almost like, okay, let's do this together. Let's try to figure this out together. And I think that's where the two-eyed seeing comes in and plays. Like, I think that whole concept that Elder Albert identified with his wife and brought to light, it's like TRC. It has just opened up so many doors and opportunities for more education.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Great. All right, we'll move on to the next question. I'll flip the page.
Sure. Oh, okay, thanks.
So in Canadian studies classes, such as grade 11 Canadian history in the Nova Scotia curriculum, the curriculum documents only focus on demonstrating an understanding of how pre-contact and post-contact Indigenous peoples' governing structure and practices were reflective in their societies and analyzing the struggles of First Nations to reestablish sovereignty. What are your thoughts on the lack of inclusion on a positive history of Indigenous people's success as opposed to just focusing on the struggle of Indigenous peoples?
Yeah, well, I know the school system can have a big impact on educating, the formal school system, especially when it comes to educating the non-Indigenous population. I think it's very vital to I guess, be able to use the system to help educate. When we look at present day, and we look at, for example, the course you just mentioned, the grade 11 course, it used to be grade 10 and now it's grade 11. One of the things that I saw, and I think it still prevails, is unfortunately we can't find Indigenous teachers to be teaching that course.
Yeah.
We're hearing a couple more. We're hearing of a couple that now has their BED and would like to go be able to teach that course. But for the most part, it's non-Indigenous teachers teaching that course. So, in all due respect to that, they're actually teaching it from probably book read themselves.
Yep.
Right? They probably read all kinds of awesome books, the Doug Knockwoods and the Isabel Knockwood, like all the great books, but it's still book read. It's not hands-on personal experience or that sort of thing, right? So that's one challenge that I think is faced with that system right now. One of the things I find, though, when we have the book read versus the actual hands-on, because I do remember one teacher, and that's the other thing too, you don't keep having the same teacher. Like, you could have a great teacher teaching that course who's non-Indigenous, doing a wonderful job, but they only do it for that year, and then another teacher takes over. It's like, no, keep them there because they're doing a great job, right? And their heart's there and their intent is there, is good. And what I'm finding is that individual would actually have community connection. They would go to community, they would sit with the elders. I heard them say they went into a sweat lodge and they went to powwows and they were doing offerings at the sacred fire. So they were giving hands-on education. Like, this is my experience doing this stuff, right? Or worked in the community or had worked on projects where they were able to bring a different educational moment to the students as opposed to what was read in that book, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's one thing that we're challenged with right now in present day until we get more. And I think one of the challenges with that too that can be really fixed is that to lower the standards for teaching that course. Like, you have to have a BED and you have, and I mean, in all due respect, I don't have a BED. I have a BA, but I really feel like I could teach that course, right? Just from my, 60 plus years of experience, and all the other jobs, I really feel I could, as I know there are many others out there that could too. Yeah. But because we don't have that paper that says we have a BED, we can't teach that course. So I think the lowering a little bit of standards so that, hey, no, maybe we need to look at this. Or just like they do at universities, you have your professor, but then you have an assistant or an associate. So they work under that professor. Why can't they do that at schools, right? And what was interesting during COVID, they were having a hard time getting subs and all that stuff. And I was actually put on the list to be able to be used as a substitute because I had a BA, right? As long as you had a university degree, you could go in as a substitute in a classroom. And that just blew my mind. I'm like, well, why did it take COVID for you to figure that out? Like, why? So, but when COVID got over with, then it seemed like that went away too. And I'm like, well, wait a minute, I could still, and like, if that's the case, then why can't you let me go in and, do some work in that classroom? Yeah. I would go in as guest speaker, but, it was only periodically, it wasn't the whole time. So those are kind of little challenges that I see that's in the present day system. And it's taught from an academic perspective.
Yeah.
It's not taught by a layman's perspective or from that person that has that innate ability or, has ever sat down and like interviewed or had that one-on-one talk with the elders. So they really get a personal concept, that their own, like I said, they're just bringing that book, the book taught. And again, when it comes to teaching or providing education in the school systems, why at grade 11? Why can't you start that in primary or pre-primary, whatever it's called now, right? Like, why isn't that developed for every class going, just like you do English or math? The curriculum, each grade you go into, it gets a little bit more in depth, right? Why can't you do that with Indigenous history? I don't know. I don't have the answer for that, but it makes me always wonder that. Like, why can't you do that? To me, it seems very simple. What a simple way to address that, right? Also, even having more Indigenous things around to make the Indigenous people not only feel and students feel welcomed, but also helping to educate the non-Indigenous people. I don't know if you noticed the signs out in the lawns. It's the "Did you know" posters. Have you seen them?
I didn't see them. Do you?
I didn't.
Well, that's just.
We'll take a look on our way out.
But they're plastered all over campus. Yeah,
Okay.
Oh,
and
right,
they're
neat.
called "Did you know?" and it's celebrating, of course, Indigenous History Month.
Okay.
And so there's these posters placed out. So it's like doing things like that so that not only as an Indigenous person, I see that, I get this sense of pride that the school's doing this, but also it's even making me feel better to know non-Indigenous people are getting some education as well, right? And hopefully they're taking heed to that. And then the other is one of the things I find when you come into most places, whether it's a school setting or whatever, a lot of things are always in English and French, and we now know that Mi'kmaq is seen as the first language of Nova Scotia. It came into play like October of, I think it was 2022 or 21 or something like that. And I'm like, still not seeing a whole lot of efforts to bring more, language into the workplace. I mean, it's come a long ways. I mean, we're seeing Ipjalasi on the signs now, road signs. Great, love seeing that. But still, people don't understand what that means. They just thinks it means welcome, right? But, through education, it means way more than that, right? Yeah. We already know that. So, and the other thing I believe that the school systems, and anybody, not just schools, it can be anything even outside of education, is looking at those TRC's call to actions. And in your workplace or your environment, identify which of those actions you'd like to commit to. Even as a human being, you could go through them as an individual and say, you know what, I like that call of action right there because that's something I know I can do something about, and then carry that with you everywhere you go throughout your life. And I just told the group this morning that it's not, and post them, like if I walk into, let's say, the president's office, maybe all of the calls to action that Mount St. Vincent is undertaking is there on a wall in a poster. So it lets me know, like, oh, wow, the Mount's doing this and that. And you don't have to worry about taking them down because they never stop. Like, you don't do this, like, okay, I checked that one off, I did it, because it's forever.
It's lifelong.
It's lifelong, yeah. And so those are also things that I think would be very helpful to be using in the system to just to help keep the education going.
Definitely.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
No, I really like that you brought up the call to actions. Do you think that is something that shall almost be included in the classroom as commitments to? Absolutely.
When the kids walk in, there should be, like I said, that poster should be up there reminding them every day, it's just like the code of ethics, like always have good manners, say please and thank you, right? It's the same thing, always reminding us, right?
Yeah.
It's the same thing, calls of action, because like I said, TRC really opened up the door across Canada. And we, as Indigenous people, many of us will say, when we hear the word or the number 215, Does the 215 ring a bell to you?
It does not. I
Nope.
can't say it does.
Good. Okay, I'm glad you said that. This is an educational moment.
Perfect.
But for us, when we hear 215, that was the number that Canada spread Canada-wide about how many unmarked graves they found at residential school burial grounds.
Wow.
Right? 215 unmarked burial grounds, or buries were thing. And so here's 215 students that went to the residential school and they don't know who they are. I don't know how, I can't even begin to tell you how that came to light or how that came to be, but the minute Canada announced that, that's when everything just, the doors started opening everywhere. And that's when the government formed the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and so on and so on. And that's what led us even here today to be talking about these things, is because the TRC and all those calls to action, 92 of them, right? So there's, I think it's 92, 94.
94.
94, okay, 94. So that's where we'll still be dealing with them. 100 years from now, we should still be dealing with them, right? Or we still should be making sure they're alive and well and everybody's still abiding by them, making sure, yep, you know what, we're doing this and we're going to make sure we continue to do this, right? That it doesn't stop.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right.
Do you have anything more to add, Finlay?
Nothing on this topic.
All right.
But I think we'll have a lot to dissect for the next question. Which is a similar question, but I feel a lot more we can do with it. And that is, how do you think Indigenous people's cultural practices can be applied to Nova Scotia secondary school classrooms?
Yeah, and it's kind of reiterating some of those, like I mentioned, you know. Yeah. Why can't you order or offer course options? Yeah. Right? Just like you can, you know, you offer French or you offer this, or why can't you offer Mi'kmaq too? Right, for the student to be able, especially high schooler, you know, because you can sometimes choose. Yeah, but again, at the same time, then incorporating though, every class you go into, there's going to be a section that just deals with Indigenous history or Indigenous culture, so that you're going to learn that all the way up, right up through university too, for that matter, because we're seeing that now, right? And have that visible land acknowledgement. You know, now I know a lot of people, I know even for me, when I'm a part of a ceremony or celebration or event where they've asked me to come and do the welcoming to Mi'kmaq, which I really enjoy doing, and then someone from that organization does the land acknowledgement. And when they're saying that from their heart, oh my, it just has so much meaning and it means so much more. And I may, you know, we may pair up and do this for 5 or 6 meetings in a row, and every time they'll say it a little different, right? And so that to me is has so much more meaning to us, you know, from the First Nation perspective. However, walking into a space and seeing a poster up though that says "We acknowledge being in Mi'kmaq," you know, like even that does my heart good too, right? So that I know everybody that walks in there is seeing that, and to me, it's the first time in like 500 years that we're now hearing it. And so it's like, keep it coming. Don't stop now, right? Keep it coming, the other is having a lot more visibility of our artists. Like all schools and places have beautiful artwork and things like that. But and we know we've got a lot of beautiful artists out there in all different ways, whether it's a painting or it's a sculpture or whatever. But you know, make the effort to have more of that visible within the school systems, right? Also having that Mi'kmaq is the official language, and having that visible in the welcome signs, you know, like having it Jalasi. I know they're getting ready to do that here at I know they're doing it at Dal, they're doing it at other universities too, but here at the Mount, they're doing that as well. And so excited. I've been part of that and going to see where it's going to happen. And it's like, walking into that building is going to be amazing to see that up there in Jalasi. Yeah, really looking forward to that. And then I said, like I mentioned, just making that commitment with the TRC. And I think it's the first step, and that I would recommend to anybody is to sit down with your group, whether it's a working group, if it's all staff, whatever, and say, okay, here are the calls of actions we're going to be doing in this school, or this is the call of actions we're going to be working with from now on, that sort of thing, and identify that. I think it's totally important to do that.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Completely agree.
Mhm.
A little side note, not super relevant to the discussion, when we were
Mhm.
talking about the visibility of the artists, you would love the psychology wing at Cape Breton University.
Oh, I'm sure. Yes.
It is entirely decorated with Indigenous art. It's incredible, and it's amazing artwork as well.
Yes.
I really like what you said about when these land acknowledgements are unique and tailored, and they sound like they mean it.
Mhm.
I was wondering if on the other end of that, when someone drones through a kind of a cookie cutter land acknowledgement, if you would ever feel like they're kind of just like getting that out of the way legislatively before they can get.
Remember when I said earlier in the interview that not everybody is 100% on board?
Yeah.
Right? It's no different with this.
It's
It's like if they weren't probably told they had to do it because of the work environment, they probably wouldn't do it.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that happens, but you also have to give a little credit to people that don't like to do public speaking.
That's
right?
true.
They like, what do I say? Like they're maybe a little scared to be saying the wrong thing. They don't want to say something to offend somebody. So when they're asked to do this, they're like, oh my God, what do I say? What do I do? Right? So you have to allow for that too sometimes. But because I've been there and heard a few people, I'm like, yeah, I could have read that too, But I do try to keep an open mind that, you know what, that's fine. You know what, at least it's done. Somebody has done it. And that's more important than when it doesn't get done.
Absolutely.
Right? So,
Yeah.
We still have ways to go.
An absolute, just like if they didn't do it, that
Yeah.
would be a huge step in towards ignorance.
Yeah.
Obviously, yeah.
And you know what? And the other thing too is we got to be careful not to overdo it. So in other words, I go to a lot of meetings, like I'm on a lot of committees.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? We don't need to say it every time we have a committee meeting, right? Like, when we've had that first meeting maybe for the school year, then yes, we do a big to-do about it. But we don't need to be doing it every time,
That's
time,
fair.
right?
Yeah.
And, but at the same time also respecting where we are, like you could just say something, let's not forget we're here in Mi'kma'ki, like just something simple, but to acknowledge. So that's the other thing we got to be careful of too, is we don't want to turn people off by doing it too much. Right?
Absolutely.
Or it becomes so repetitive that people aren't even listening anyway.
Yeah.
Right? So that's the things that we do have to consider as well.
I agree with that. I can totally, coming from sort of, I guess, I'd say subtler culture, amongst other people who hear these land acknowledgements constantly, there often can be people who have attitudes that they feel like they're just being sermons to after a certain point.
Yeah.
With all the repetitiveness. But yeah, I do feel with the steps towards like land back, it's important to constantly reiterate. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. And even if you're not sure, if you're not sure what you should say, just seek out. Seek out a First Nation person or whose territory you're in. Because I say, if you're up in Maliseet country, then you know what? Seek out a Maliseet person there and help them to help you. What's the land? How should I say land acknowledgement here, right?
Absolutely.
Because I've heard a lot of them. Even as a Mi'kmaq person, I don't agree with a lot of them, right?
Yeah.
I'm like, no, I wouldn't say that, or but then that's not me, right? Like, it's not for me to tell them, kind of, I wouldn't say that. But at the same time, I might express a way to maybe encourage them to think about saying it differently. But
right.
But you've got all kinds. Like for example, I'll be truthful when we talk about the treaties during a land acknowledgement. I get a little concerned with that because once you say treaty, then you're bringing a certain date into it, and you're taking away from. Wait a minute, the Mi'kmaq have been here for 14,000 years. When you talk treaties, you're only talking from like 1700 up.
Yeah.
Right? So once you say treaty, then I'm like, you're missing the point though, right?
Yeah.
I completely
it takes away
that.
from the actual, we've been here this long.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah. So but that's just me,
No, it's totally
and I know
fair.
people still want to do it, and that's fair. I'm like, okay, each to their own, but it's just not something that I just always say, okay, you could say that, but just But remember, remember, they've still been here for 14,000 years. It's like you could put a bottom line, right?
And risking my pride asking this, how was our land acknowledgement today?
Oh, you were good.
Fantastic.
It felt heartfelt. Like you thought about it. You thought about it.
I even did a little bit of research into it.
There you go.
I was very proud of myself. I'm happy.
Yeah. And I'm not saying don't, you still do what I always say, like if you speak from your heart, you can't go wrong. Right, and if your intent is positive and respectful, you can't go wrong. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, you're in a good path that way. Yeah.
No, one of my favorite things that we've done this course was we've done group facilitations where two of us have led the class, talking about an academic reading and how we can nurture further knowledge as educators. And then the second part of that activity has been, or of the facilitations, has been creating an activity that would connect indigeneity with course curriculums. And when I started the course, I was really nervous about that side of, I was so nervous of how I could connect some form of culture from the people of the First Nations into any given course. And now that I look at it, how could I not? There's so many possibilities. And that was one of the most eye-opening things I've had.
Good for you. That's the thing. If no matter what you do, if you walk away with any kind of teaching or learning that helps educate you, then you know what? That's good. I don't know if I mentioned this in the workshop that you guys have been in, but my brother always, when he had his group settings, he would always tell them he hopes they came in with 1 million questions, but they leave with 2 million.
Yeah.
Right? Because we know that we've just intrigued a little bit that now they want to learn more. Right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Anything else we want to add before moving on to the final question?
No, I'm good.
All right.
All right. So, if there were a message you would like to internalize in the current and future Nova Scotian secondary school educators, what would that be?
Well, I think it's pretty simple, and I've said it several times. It's incorporate and make a sincere commitment to the TRC, to that truth and reconciliation, and we like to call it action now. We're gone past reconciliation. It's now action. We want to see action, right? And identify that your visible practices, and make known, yearly, like whoever's in charge, like whether it's the principal or whoever, like make a note to the staff that say, hey, here's the TRCs, here's the call of actions we're incorporating, and look at all the things we did to help bring that to light in our school, right? So it's like not just say you're doing it, show us, show what you're doing, send it out to parents with the, home notices that you do with kids, right? Hey, look, here's what we're doing for Indigenous. Again, you're not going to have all parents saying, Yahoo! But at the same time, a lot of them would be probably interested to know that school is taking that initiative, right?
I bet.
Yeah, and that in doing that, it can only cause for positive intergenerational effects, not just within the Indigenous, but the non-Indigenous as well. Because remember how I said if we can start at a young age trying to change the mindset, so that maybe there will come a time in our society that we won't be so prejudiced against, or there won't be so many racism remarks made to us, or whatever, that because kids will, I've already heard parents saying, yeah, my child come home the other day and taught me something about culture, right? Like, so that they never knew. So there you go. Like, so it has a big impact because they haven't been formed yet. Their brain hasn't been taught racism and all that stuff. Well, hopefully they haven't, at that young age. Yeah. And so that we can still instill the positive. So when we say intergenerational effects, we can actually look at it from a positive perspective now, right? Not because right now when you think intergenerational effects, you think of what the residential school negatives have had on all our generations. Well, let's kind of switch it around now and let's make some positive intergenerational effects. And I think that's a way to go.
Start planting seeds that will flourish.
Absolutely. And it's for all of us, right? For all of us, yeah. So that two-eyed seeing will become just common nature. Yeah. We'll all know the two-eyed seeing. Yeah. Absolutely. We won't have to sit at the table and, okay, how would you do this? Because we'll already know.
Yeah, definitely.
Yep.
All right. Do you have any more thoughts, Finlay?
None.
Just for the concluding thoughts. The only more remaining question I have for you is, what would the Mi'kmaq word be for thank you? or phrase.
Okay, if you guys are thanking me, you would, if you're thanking one person, you would say Walalin.
Walalin.
If I'm saying thank you to you, I will say Walaliok.
Okay.
If your organization was thanking me, they would say Walaliek. Yeah, so you guys would say Walalin, I would say Walaliok, mainly.
And if we were to thank anybody watching this, would we say Walalio?
If there was a number of people you know were watching it, you would say Walaliok.
All right, well, Walalin and Walalio.
Yeah, there you go. That works. Easy, right?
Wonderful.
Yeah.